In March 1964, New York witnessed one of the most gruesome crime scenes of the 20th century. Kitty Genovese became the unfortunate victim who, through her death, brought awareness around society, apathy, and the nature of evil. Back in those days, they didn't have the 911 emergency number we rely on today, and there were no laws to protect Good Samaritans. She cried out for help for hours, but no one came to her rescue. Hi, and welcome back to Crime Case Files. Before we begin, let's take a moment to remember the tragic death of the bright soul taken from us, and we offer our deepest condolences to those still affected by her loss. Catherine Susan, also known as Kitty Genovese, was born on July 7, 1935, in Brooklyn, New York City. She was the eldest of 5 kids born to Italian-American parents, Rachel and Vincent Andronell Genovese. She grew up on 29 St. John's Place in Park Slope, a neighborhood in western Brooklyn with many Italian and Irish families. As a teenager, she went to Prospect Heights High School, an all-girls school where she was known for her confident and cheerful nature. After a traumatic incident in which her mother witnessed a murder, her family decided to move to Connecticut in 1954. But Kitty had just graduated from high school and she wanted to stay behind in Brooklyn to live with her grandparents as she prepared for her upcoming wedding. Her marriage took place later that year, but it was dissolved soon in 1954 as she came to terms with her sexuality as same-sex attraction. Her decision to stay in New York was not only because she felt more independent there, but also because of the presence of a welcoming LGBTQ community, something she couldn't find in Connecticut at the time. After relocating to her new Brooklyn apartment, she moved from one desk job to another, but she found them unfulfilling and a waste of time. By the late 1950s, she secured a bartending job, which she liked since she enjoyed socializing with her customers and co-workers. In August 1961, she faced a brief arrest for bookmaking, as she had been taking bets on horse races from bar patrons. She and her friend, Dee Guarnieri, were fined $50 each, and Kitty lost her job as a result. She soon found another bartending gig at Ev's 11th Hour Bar in Hollis, Queens, where she was promoted to managing the bar when the owner was absent. By working double shifts, she managed to save money with dreams of opening her own Italian restaurant. She shared her Kew Gardens apartment on Austin Street with her girlfriend since 1963, Mary Ann Zilonko. Around 2:30 a.m. on March 13, 1964, Kitty left the bar where she worked and began driving home in her red Fiat. She stopped at a traffic light on Hoover Avenue when she caught the eye of a man sitting across the road in his parked Chevrolet Corvair. When she arrived home around 3:15 a.m., she parked her car in the Kew Gardens Long Island Railroad Station parking lot about 100 feet from her apartment's door, which was in an alleyway at the back of the building. As she walked towards her apartment, the man, who had followed her home, exited his car, which he'd parked at a bus stop on Austin Street. He was armed with a hunting knife, and he approached Genovese from behind. She quickly noticed him and became frightened. She started to run toward the front of her building, with the man in pursuit. He eventually caught up to her and stabbed her twice in the back, leading her to cry out in shock. "Oh my gosh, he hurt me! Please help!" Her cries were heard by several neighbors, though only a few understood that she needed assistance. One of the neighbors, Robert Moser, yelled at the man to leave the young woman alone. The assailant promptly fled the scene, leaving Kitty to slowly make her way to the back entrance of her building, suffering from serious injuries and out of view of any potential witnesses. Several witnesses observed the suspicious actions of the attacker. They saw him depart in his car and return roughly 10 minutes later, this time concealing his identity with a broad-brimmed hat. He methodically searched the entire train station, parking lot, and nearby apartment complex. During his search, he eventually discovered Kitty, who was barely conscious and lay defenseless in a hallway at the rear of the building. Unfortunately, a locked door prevented her from entering. Shielded from the view of the street and any potential witnesses to the initial attack, the assailant inflicted further harm, sexually assaulted her, took $49 from her, and then quickly fled the scene. The entire assault went on for approximately half an hour, and signs of knife wounds on her hands revealed her attempts at trying to defend herself. Kitty's neighbor and dear friend, Sophia Farrar, found her shortly after the second assault. In an attempt to console her friend, Sophia held Kitty in her arms and reassured her until an ambulance finally arrived. Records regarding the initial police calls are somewhat unclear, and they weren't given the high priority they deserved. One witness mentioned that his father contacted the police after the initial attack, reporting that a woman had been beaten badly and couldn't stand up. Minutes after the final assault, another witness named Carl Ross contacted friends for advice on the situation before eventually dialing the police. An ambulance eventually arrived at 4:15 a.m. to pick up Kitty, but she succumbed to her injuries during the journey to the hospital. Her final resting place is in Lakeview Cemetery in New Canaan, Connecticut, where she was laid to rest on March 16, 1964. The morning after the murder, Mary Ann Zelonko, Kitty's girlfriend, found herself facing Detective Mitchell Sang's questioning at 7 a.m., but that was just the beginning. Later, two homicide detectives, John Carroll and Jerry Burns, forced her into a grueling 6-hour interrogation. Their focus was on Genovese and Zelonko's relationship, and the police aimed their inquiries in the same direction when speaking with the neighbors. At this early stage, Zelonko was clearly considered a suspect, adding to the already overwhelming ordeal for her. Just 6 days after the stabbing incident, Winston Moseley was arrested in Ozone Park under suspicion of robbery. The bizarre turn of events leading to his arrest began when a television set was discovered in the trunk of his car. A vigilant local resident, Raoul Cleary, grew suspicious after seeing Moseley removing a television from his neighbor's house. Cleary confronted Moseley, who tried to pass himself off as a removal worker. Doubtful of Moseley's claim, Cleary decided to seek the opinion of another neighbor, Jack Brown, who confirmed that the homeowners had no intentions of moving. With his suspicions now validated, Cleary quickly called the police. To make sure that Moseley didn't escape, Brown took matters into his own hands and disabled Moseley's vehicle, stopping him from fleeing before the police arrived. A detective soon realized that the white car used by Moseley was very similar to the one reported by several witnesses who had seen Kitty's murder. This discovery led to detectives Carroll and Sang being informed of the situation. During the course of their questioning, Moseley ended up confessing not only to Kitty's murder, but also to the murders of two other women, Annie Mae Johnson, who had been shot and burned to death in her apartment in South Ozona Park a few weeks earlier, and 15-year-old Barbara Kralik, who had been murdered in her parents' Springfield Gardens home the previous July. In the aftermath of Kitty's murder, the media didn't pay much attention. However, a turn of events occurred when New York City Police Commissioner Michael J. Murphy made a comment over lunch to A.M. Rosenthal, the metropolitan editor of the New York Times. Murphy remarked that the Queen's story was one for the books, and that comment served as the catalyst to push the Times into publishing a thorough investigative report on the case. The public's perception of the Kitty Genovese case revolved around one quote from the article, provided by an anonymous neighbor who had seen part of the attack but hesitated before calling the police. They said on the call that they didn't want to get involved. This reluctance to intervene struck a chord with many and showed the apathy in the lives of city people, particularly within the bustling metropolis of New York. Science fiction author Harlan Ellison added to the discussion by saying that 38 people watched as Genovese was attacked on a New York street, and not one person made the slightest effort to save her, to scream at the perpetrator, or even to call the police. He found reports claiming that one individual who had seen the murder from his third-floor apartment admitted to quickly turning up the sound on his radio to drown out the woman's screams. Despite the murder becoming a huge symbol of urban apathy, another incident occurred. A New York Times article dated December 28, 1974, revealed another case. 10 years after Kitty's murder, a 25-year-old woman named Sandra Zala was beaten to death during the early hours of Christmas morning. Her apartment was in a building that overlooked the very location of Kitty's attack. Yet again, neighbors admitted to hearing screams but chose not to intervene or help. In his book, A.M. Rosenthal tried to understand the human behavior of helping or not helping a victim, a question that puzzled behavioral scientists. Surprisingly, he couldn't find any real answers from these experts. However, the chief detective, Albert Seidman, questioned the perpetrator about his act, asking how he could assault a woman with so many witnesses present. He answered saying that he knew they wouldn't do anything because people never do. But there's more to this complex issue. Psychologist Frances Cherry suggested that framing the murder solely as a bystander intervention problem wasn't fair. She pointed to additional research showing that people were unlikely to intervene if they thought a man was attacking his wife or girlfriend. Cherry proposed a more balanced perspective, focusing on the dynamics of male-female power relationships. The lack of response from all the neighbors, even if inaccurately reported, began investigations into the concept of the bystander effect. Social psychologists John M. Darley and Bib Latani were pioneers in this research. They discovered that contrary to common assumptions, when there are more bystanders, the likelihood of someone stepping forward to help a victim decreases. This happens because witnesses often interpret others not helping as a sign not to intervene. They assume someone else knows better, or that it's uncertain to help while others are watching. The Genovese case became a key component of social psychology textbooks in the United States and the United Kingdom. In September 2007, American psychologists published an examination of the facts from Kitty's murder coverage in psychology textbooks. The author's conclusion was that the case was more like a moral lesson than an accurate account due to the huge amount of misleading newspaper coverage at the time of the incident. Despite the absence of concrete evidence, the Genovese case continued to feature in introductory social psychology textbooks, shaping the minds of future social psychologists. A survey of 10 leading undergraduate psychology textbooks revealed that all 10 included the Genovese case. 8 of them suggested that witnesses watched from their windows as Kitty was murdered, while 2 textbooks indicated that some or most of the witnesses heard but couldn't see the attack. Later investigations cast doubt on the original account of the events surrounding Kitty's murder. In 2004, Jim Reisenberger's article in the New York Times, published on the 40th anniversary of the murder, raised huge questions about the claims made in the initial Times article. A study conducted in 2007 and confirmed in 2014 found that many of the facts about the murder were baseless. It concluded that there was no evidence showing that 38 witnesses were present, or that witnesses actually saw the murder, or that witnesses didn't try to help. Following Mosley's death in March 2016, the New York Times acknowledged that their story was flawed, and they clarified that while there was no doubt the attack took place and that some neighbors ignored cries for help, the original story of the 38 witnesses fully ignoring the attack was false. The article greatly exaggerated the number of witnesses and their level of awareness. In reality, none of them saw the entire attack. Only a few caught glimpses of certain parts or recognized the cries for help. Many believed they had overheard a lover's quarrels or some intoxicated dispute. The actual account revealed that 2 people actually did call the police. A 70-year-old woman came out of her apartment to cradle the victim in her arms until help arrived, but Genovese passed away en route to the hospital. The complex layout of the area and the separate locations of the attacks contributed to the fact that no witness saw the entire sequence of events. Police and prosecutors discovered that approximately a dozen individuals had either heard or seen parts of the attack, although none were aware of the full incident. Only one witness, Joseph Fink, realized that Genovese was stabbed during the first attack, and Carl Ross was the sole witness to this in the second attack. Many others had no idea that an assault or murder had occurred. Some misinterpreted what they saw or heard as a domestic dispute, a drunken brawl, or a group of friends leaving the bar when Mosley initially approached Genovese. After the initial attack, which punctured her lungs and led to her eventual death from asphyxiation, it is unlikely that Genovese was physically capable of screaming loudly. In a 2015 documentary that featured Kitty's brother, William, a new revelation emerged. Crime reporters in 1964 were already aware of significant issues with the story. Right after the story made headlines, Danny Meehan, a police reporter from WNBC, found numerous inconsistencies within the original New York Times article. Meehan wondered why Martin Gansberg, the Times reporter, hadn't disclosed that the witnesses didn't believe a murder was taking place. Gansberg's response was candid but troubling, saying that it would have ruined the story. Concerned about the potential repercussions of challenging someone as influential as Rosenthal, Meehan opted to keep his discoveries under wraps. He quietly passed his notes to his colleague, Gabe Pressman, at WNBC. At a later point, when Pressman was teaching a journalism course, some of his students confronted Rosenthal with this evidence. His response was one of anger and frustration as he resented his editorial decisions being scrutinized by journalism students. The tragic murder of Kitty played a big role in the establishment of the 911 emergency system. New York City officials collaborated with authorities from other cities, leading to the creation of 911 as the national emergency number in 1968. The story of the witnesses who failed to intervene, despite its factual inaccuracies, has left a lasting mark on psychology education. It's a topic covered in introductory psychology textbooks across the United States, the United Kingdom, and various other countries. It has also achieved widespread recognition through television programs, books, and even songs. Winston Moseley was born in Ozone Park, Queens, and worked as a tab operator at Remington Rand, a job involving preparing punched cards for data input in early digital computers. He was a married man with 3 children, and up until that point, he had no criminal record to his name. While in custody, Moseley admitted to the murder of Genovese and went into gruesome detail, confirming the evidence found at the crime scene. He confessed that his motive was nothing more than a desire to take the life of any random woman. He explained that he specifically targeted women because he believed they were easier to overpower and less likely to resist. On that night, he woke up around 2 a.m. while his wife was busy with her night shift as a registered nurse and drove around the streets of Queens on a mission to find a victim. By complete chance, he spotted Kitty as she went home and began to follow her. He also confessed to being responsible for almost 30 to 40 burglaries. His psychiatric evaluations revealed that Moseley had a disturbing profile and was also a necrophile. Winston Moseley faced charges for Genovese's murder, but ended up not being charged for the other 2 murders he had openly admitted to committing. That's because another individual, Alvin Mitchell, had also confessed to being responsible for the murder of Barbara Kralik, which made it difficult for the case to stick on Moseley. His trial began on June 8, 1964, with Judge J. Irwin Shapiro overseeing the proceedings. Initially, Moseley pleaded not guilty, but later, his attorney altered his plea to not guilty by reason of insanity. In a turn of events, Moseley took the stand during his testimony, providing a detailed account of the night he took Kitty's life. The jury spent 7 hours discussing the case before announcing a guilty verdict around 10:30 p.m. on June 11th. On June 15th, Moseley was sentenced to death for the murder of Genovese. His reaction was completely emotionally detached, in stark contrast to the jury members, who actually applauded and cheered after the guilty verdict. Despite his reservations about capital punishment, Judge Shapiro said that seeing a monster like Moseley made him want to pull the switch himself. On June 23rd, Moseley found himself testifying as a defense witness during Alvin Mitchell's trial for the murder of Barbara Kralik. In exchange for immunity from prosecution, he openly admitted of taking the life of Kralik. Although the initial trial ended in a hung jury, Mitchell was later convicted in a second trial. Finally, on June 1st, 1967, the New York Court of Appeals decided that Moseley should have been allowed to argue that he was medically insane during the sentencing hearing, despite the trial court finding him legally sane. As a result, his sentence was reduced to life imprisonment. On March 18, 1968, Moseley managed to break free while being transported from Meyer Memorial Hospital in Buffalo, New York. He had been receiving treatment for a self-inflicted minor injury. In an attempt to escape, Moseley struck the correctional officer responsible for his transportation, grabbed his gun, and vanished into the night. For 3 days, he hid out in a vacant house owned by a couple from Grand Island, Mrs. and Mr. Matthew Kulaga. On March 21st, as the Kulagas went to check up on their house, they stumbled upon Moseley, who held them hostage for over an hour. He tied up Matthew and then sexually assaulted Mrs. Kulaga. Then he stole their car and vanished again. He traveled to Grand Island, where on March 22nd he broke into another residence, taking a woman and her daughter hostage for 2 hours before finally releasing them without harm. After that, he surrendered to the police and was charged with escape and kidnapping. He pleaded guilty and received 2 additional 15-year sentences set to run along with his existing life sentence. Later, in September 1971, Moseley became involved in the infamous Attica prison riot. Then, while he was still behind bars, he managed to obtain a Bachelor of Arts in Sociology, courtesy of Niagara University. The possibility of parole emerged in 1984 for him, but during his initial parole hearing, Moseley said that the infamy of his crimes had turned him into a helpless victim. In his own words, he said that he was now a victim forever because of what he did. He argued that he never wanted to take the life of Genovese and believed that her murder was just like a mugging. However, his parole request was rejected by the board. He returned for another parole hearing on March 13, 2008, marking the 44th anniversary of Kitty's murder. Despite this lengthy period behind bars, he showed little remorse for the life he had taken. His request for parole was turned down again. As for Kitty's brother, Vincent, who was unaware of the 2008 parole hearing until reporters from the New York Daily News contacted him. The wounds of his sister's murder had never healed, and he admitted that it brought back what happened to her. Mosley faced yet another parole denial in November 2015 and passed away in prison on March 28, 2016, at the age of 81, having served 52 years, making him one of the longest-serving inmates in the New York State prison system. Our discussion on the Kitty Genovese case comes to an end. If you found this information worthwhile, we would greatly appreciate your support by giving this video a thumbs up and subscribing to our channel for additional captivating true crime content. Thank you for your viewership. Until our next encounter, stay well and stay vigilant.